So, hello everybody. Welcome to this month's Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gilbert from DynamicsWorld.com. Really pleased to welcome you all back for what should be a great theme today, a history of Power Pages. Not sure if put on our old-timey clothes or talk in an old-timey way or something, but this could be interesting. It's a great history from what I know of it. Um, I'm going to hand things over to our presenter, Nicholas Hayduk, in just a moment, but please do know that we do welcome your questions today. Please enter those anytime. I know Nick keeps a close eye on the questions queue, and we're also recording today's event, so we will be making that available after the session ends. So with that, Nick, I'm going to hand things over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, today's topic, there's a bit of a history on why we're doing the history today, and I'll get into that when we get to it. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming today, and hope you get some value out of chatting about the history of Power Pages, as well as we can chat about some release notes that have come out since we last met. So let's dive into it. So for those of you, if this is your first call, for your first kind of time getting into the Power Pages space, my name is Nicholas Hayduk. I'm the president and a software engineer at Engineered Code Consulting Inc. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been doing this for quite a long time. We'll talk about what ADX Studio means if you're not familiar with ADX Studio. But I did start working there in about 2009 and have been working on Power Pages ever since. If you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter, or follow or subscribe to our YouTube channel, or the podcast that we do, please go ahead and do that if that's your, if you want to do that. I am fairly active on most of those channels, so happy to always get feedback on those. Especially, I'd like to hear from people what it is they want to see, what are the topics they like to hear about. So please send in your feedback, and we'll do our best to get things covered. So that's me. Of course, we got Jason and his team behind the scenes at MS Dynamics World. Just always want to thank them for their support over the years. It's kind of crazy that we can say years. It's been, I think, at least 3 years we've been doing this, so it's been a while. So they've been a great partner to have, and really appreciate all the work that they do. Yeah, so our agenda, as usual, we got some portal news, and we got quite a bit of news today because we do have the release notes that were put out on I think it was the 25th, a couple weeks ago anyways. We have today's topic, which is a history of Power Pages, and really it's actually more of a history of Power Platform, Dynamics 365, all that sort of stuff, and just trying to give some background on where this product came from and the ecosystem that it lives in. So that's the plan for today. We'll talk about the next call, and there'll most likely be some time for Q&A. If you do have any questions, as Jason mentioned, there's the questions block, so feel free to drop your questions in there, and I'll do my very best to not forget to check that other screen of mine that has that open, and see if I can get your questions answered. All right, let's talk about the portal news, which, of course, the big news since we last had one of these community calls is the Power Platform release plan for 2023 Wave 1. So if you're not kind of familiar with what the release plans are, I guess the first thing to know is nothing set in stone. So these aren't necessarily promises, but it's kind of the hopes and dreams of Microsoft, what they hope to do over a 6-month period for Power Platform, and the same thing also exists for Dynamics as well. So they release these plans. They generally cover, the release wave 1 generally covers, I think, April through September, and then there's another release wave 2 covers October through to the following March. So those are kind of the 6-month blocks that Microsoft releases kind of the plans for. And they always kind of release these plans in advance, usually about 3 months in advance. They put out, here's what we're hoping to do, and within those plans there are different dates, and again, it's all the features saying, hey, this feature might be coming available in public preview, might be generally available, and that's what these plans are. So there's this kind of 6-month rolling, 6-month period where Microsoft releases these plans kind of 3 months in advance, and it's kind of a window into what we hope to see over the next little while. again, there's really no promises made. Sometimes things are added to it, sometimes things are removed from it. But it is kind of their best effort to put out what you can expect over the next little while. So let's talk about what we have related to Power Pages. It used to be back in the day when the release plans came out, I would have to search through the PDF looking for the word portals. That is certainly no longer the case with Power Pages being a full-fledged member of the Power Platform now. It gets its own entire section, which is great. So I'm just going to add kind of at a high level here, go through some of the features, or I guess all the features that were Power Pages related that were in that section in the release notes. So the first one was a data loss prevention control, which is essentially a way for administrators to require forced authentication for all users on a site. So right now that control just doesn't exist. So they are giving away within the kind of the policies area on the administrative side of things to say, do you know what? I don't care whether the maker chooses to force authentication. I'm overriding that decision. I'm requiring all users to be authenticated on a Power Pages site. So a simple little, flipping of a switch, but could prevent a lot of bad things if you have makers in there that may not realize the ramifications of what they're doing. Next one we have on the list here is website inventory. This one, I don't know, I kind of laugh because it's not going to blow anyone away. I'm sure it's going to be useful, but basically it's a button where you can click and it'll download a CSV file that has a list of your Power Pages sites. I don't think Microsoft spent a lot of time. I'm sure this request came from someone important, so they put it in there. But hopefully this wasn't a 3-month project for them to get a CSV download in there. But some people might find it useful. It's probably not going to change my life too much, but it's there, and some people might find it useful. We're going to get on to a couple of big ones. So one we've been asking for a very long time, and that is support for Cloudflows. Now, we're still not, I haven't seen all the details on this, but my kind of general assumption is right now, wherever you can use classic workflows from Dataverse or Dynamics 365, so you can use those on lists, and you can use them on forms where you can say, hey, run a workflow on this record. That's wherever you see that, you're going to start to see the ability to also run a Power Automate Cloudflow. I think I'm not sure exactly how it's going to be accomplished, maybe like a custom trigger or something like that. But the good news is, there's so much you can do with Power Automate. It's got so many connectors. There's so many awesome things that you can do. So it's great to see that we're going to start to be able to leverage that power without, some of the hacks that, some people, Mr. Nick Dolman, I kind of give him heck, not heck, but it's funny. I give him a little bit of trouble. He put out a blog post that said, hey, here's how you could do Power Automate flows on a portal in a very unsecure way. And so it did work, but it basically kind of exposed your flow to the world. You could have anyone be kind of firing it off. So obviously this is going to have all those security considerations taken care of. So being able to use Cloudflows in your Power Pages site, I think this is going to be a pretty big deal. I still don't know how things like caching are going to be handled. I suspect similar to how with workflows, like caching wasn't automatically, there was nothing special to say when you ran a Cloudflow or a workflow that the cache would be automatically invalidated for those things that it impacted. So I suspect it'll be along those similar lines. But it is great to see that we can have Cloudflow support in Power Pages. I see I have a question here. Is the DLP policy to force authentication settable per environment or per whole tenant? I don't know. I don't know if we have the details on that. If those details are public, I honestly don't know if that's going to be a per site thing. I hope it's a per site thing, but I guess on the other hand, if it is a per site thing, what you'd be worried about is someone who creates a new site, you don't have that control. So I don't know, it could be either. And at this point, I actually don't know the details on that one. All right, the next one is another thing that's been asked for a very, very long time, and that is an upgrade of the version of Bootstrap used by Power Pages. So currently, Power Pages uses version 3 of Bootstrap, which is many, many years old, probably close to 7 or 8 years old that version came out. And so Microsoft has released a plan to get everyone hopefully up to version 5. I think that's going to be a combination of things. So it's obviously at some point the portals, like that, if you spin up a new Power Pages site, it will be version 5 just out of the box. But they also seem to have some plans for helping people migrate. So it's not just go ahead, do it yourself. It does sound like there is going to be some assistance in terms of tools or something that's going to help people upgrade their existing Power Pages, Power Apps portals, Dynamics 365 portal sites up to version 5 of Bootstrap. So I believe when I was looking at this the other day, that the language was they are going to be kind of both supported for a certain period of time. But I do think at some point the upgrade to version 5 will be required. So which I think is a good move. You don't want to support that old stuff for too long and kind of force people to upgrade. I know some people using Bootstrap 5 already. They just kind of did it themselves. But yeah, Bootstrap 5, that's probably, let me look at the list here. I think that's probably the biggest one. That's the one that's probably getting the most, making the most noise, getting the most, written about it. So yeah, excited to see that. And it's kind of good to bring things up to the current century anyways. All right, next on my list, there are some updates to the VS Code integrations. Now, I think this is more the VS Code Online stuff, but the two that they mention are the overwrite warnings. So essentially, if you have multiple people working on a Power Pages site at one time, if you're both working on the same thing and you both click save, the person who clicks save, the second person who clicks save is going to get a warning saying, hey, there's been some changes since you last opened this. Are you sure you want to overwrite? So that gives you an opportunity to say, maybe don't overwrite. Maybe I'll go and check to see what's there now so I don't overwrite someone else's work. So obviously not exactly like multi-user, multi-editing experience, but certainly better than overriding someone's changes. So a step in the right direction there, as well as the ability to preview within VS Code. Again, I think this is the online experience. I could be wrong, but I think it might be the online experience. But this way, like the way it works right now is you kind of get kicked over to a VS Code experience, which is like the full kind of in-browser VS Code experience, and you can make your changes to HTML, but you can't preview it in any way. You're all the way over in VS Code. With this, it sounds like you'll be able to preview that without leaving, like going to another tab or anything like that. You'll be able to somehow preview your Power Pages site and the changes that you're making right there. So that's cool. Question, how will this update differ from version control tools like Git? I'm assuming you're talking about the VS Code stuff. So VS Code is just the editor. So this really is kind of a separate item. So with the VS Code Online functionality, when you're editing a page in the Power Pages Studio, you can click a button that says, hey, I want to edit this HTML in VS Code, but it's basically just kind of like a live edit directly of the data in Dataverse. So there's no source control, there's no versioning, there's none of that. It's just essentially a different editor for making those changes. So we still would very much recommend that you have all of your stuff that you're working on in Git. We do have some other community calls that talk about ways of doing that. We use the configuration migration tool to export our changes, get those into source control. But the VS Code updates are really more about the editing experience and not the source control experience. Next topic here would be the PAC CLI. So the Power Platform command line interface will have the ability to create and delete websites. So that's pretty exciting. I'm wondering if someone's going to ask if delete actually deletes everything. I don't know the answer to that, but my guess is delete will not. I think delete will probably delete the website and the data in Dataverse. It's possible that the delete operation would just be like a reset of the portal, so it wouldn't even touch any data. It would just delete the resources associated with it. But I would be very surprised if it actually did any solution uninstalling. And I don't know, maybe it does some data cleanup, but I don't know the full details of what delete means. But I'm certainly excited about create, because that's going to certainly help with some people with some sophisticated ALM, where they spin up new environments and they're constantly like creating portals and stuff. That will make their lives a lot easier. The deletes, if you're just throwing away environments, delete's not that important. So the create is a big step. But I am kind of curious to see what delete a website means. If they have something that actually helps uninstall solutions, you wouldn't find someone happier than me that we wouldn't have to deal with that anymore. But I know kind of how complex that is, and I don't know if they're there yet. So, but yeah, so some Pax CLI options to create and delete websites. Speaking of ALM, the last thing on the list here is, and again, the details are a little fuzzy on this one, but essentially it sounds like they are going to make certain data, the data associated with Power Pages, solution aware. So traditionally, most data in Dataverse you can't add to a solution. So you can't create a contact and add it to your solution. There are some exceptions to this. There is some data that is actually solution aware. It sounds like they're going to add the web page, the Power Page data to that. So I don't know which tables are going to be included. I don't know exactly how it's going to work. But rather than using a tool like the Pax CLI to download and upload your data part of your Power Pages site, it sounds like you're going to be able to include that data as part of the solution. So it'll just export and import. So that's really cool. I mean, that's the dream in terms of ALM, that we can make as much as, the things that we want, we can make them solution aware. But of course, as with pretty much everything, the devil's in the details. So how much control do we have? Do we have to pick at a table level? Is it at a row level? Is it at a field level? Like, do we get to pick for a particular row which columns are included? There'll be lots of details to sort out there, but seeing the direction of ALM with Power Pages, that they seem to be going in the direction of it's going to be solution based, which is kind of awesome, because that's how most of the other ALM within the Power Platform works. So it's really great that Power Pages is going to, one of the big challenges that we have with Power Pages is this problem, and it looks like they're making the investments to make that easier for us. So yeah, that was the list of the items that were in the Power Platform release plan as of, I think, when I put this together on Tuesday, maybe. So as I mentioned, those things can change. So it's possible that since then something's been added, something's been removed. Again, it doesn't happen all the time, so it's probably this list. But it never hurts to take a peek. The other thing that you can see in there is whether these features are going to be in preview or whether they're going to be generally available. Sometimes you'll see the same item in multiple subsequent release plans. So you'll see it, say, in this one, and you'll see it in the next one. And that often means on the first one it was in preview, and then the next one it was generally available. So something to watch out for as well. But that was the list as of the last time I looked at it. So lots of cool things. Obviously, again, Bootstrap 5 is probably the big one that's getting all the attention. But if we look at Cloudflows and some of the ALM and Pax CLI, those are pretty big items as well. So excited to see what comes out of Microsoft and the Power Pages team in the April to September timeframe. All right, I don't see any more questions. So let's talk about, oh, right, sorry, one more news item that wasn't related to release notes. This was just up, I think, just in the last couple of days. There was a new post on the Power Pages blog, and it talked about setting up the brand of your Power Pages site, which is essentially customizing some colors and the logo in the header, which was kind of always possible, but you have to go into a certain area to kind of find those things. Apparently what they've done is they've updated it so that you can do that like just directly, like when you're on a page and you've got the header, those things become editable. So whatever page you're on, you can just click on the logo and change it, or click on some of the elements of the header and change it. So that seems new. I haven't tried it out. I just did see this blog post posted very recently, so wanted to raise attention for that one as well. All right, I think that now covers the end of our news section. So let's talk about today's topic, which is a history of Power Pages. So as I mentioned earlier, this is really not just a history of Power Pages. We're going to include some history of the whole Power Platform in general. And the reason, where I came up with this topic was we've had a few new people start here at Engineered Code over the last couple of weeks, and even over the last year, we've had a number of people start with us. And one of the things that I've always kind of felt was important was to give people the background of where we came from, especially because things change names so quickly and so often that there's such a ton of resources out there that are still super valuable, but they use a wrong name or a different name. If you look at all the tips that we do, the Power Pages tips or the Dynamics 365 Portals tips, we're over 200 tips now. I would say that you could probably count on one hand the number of tips that are not still completely accurate today. But the name of the product has changed, and so people may not realize it's like forget the name, the product is still the same. So I've always felt it was important that the people that work for us, even though we do specialize in Power Pages, we understand where this product came from, what's the history, and kind of the history of the Power Platform as well. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. So we're going to start with Power Platform. So within the Power Platform, as of today, there's kind of five main products. We've got Power BI, we've got Power Automate, we got Power Apps, Power Virtual Agent, and Power Pages. So hopefully you're somewhat familiar with those. You're aware of the existence. Power BI is essentially, BI business intelligence, reporting, that sort of stuff. You got your Power Automate, which is your, came from Microsoft, previously known as Microsoft Flow, and that's your kind of business process automation type thing. Power Apps is how you build, and there's a couple of different flavors of those. You got your different, you got your ability to kind of build apps for business users to complete certain tasks. Power Virtual Agents is your chatbots, and Power Pages is your websites. Those ones I think I should know by now. So I'm going to dive a little bit into those just to kind of give you an idea of like where did these things come from, because the thing about the Power Platform is it wasn't like one day Microsoft decided, hey, we need a Power Platform, let's go build a bunch of stuff. It really kind of worked in reverse. It was like, hey, we have all these different things. You know what? Like kind of grouped together, they become a pretty powerful tool. So a lot of these technologies came from other places within the Microsoft world. And they realized that by joining them together, they created this set of tools that could be used to build business applications. And a lot of them they built a tool for a very specific product, and then they realized, hey, not just users of this product would benefit from this. Lots of people could benefit from this, even if they're not using SharePoint or Office 365 or Dynamics 365. If we just kind of abstracted some of the very specific bits of this and made it a little bit more generic, this is a tool that everyone could use. So that's kind of where the Power Platform comes from. And that is, it comes from kind of all these different places within Microsoft that have been combined. The only kind of exception to that is Virtual Agent. I believe Virtual Agents is actually like a kind of its own thing, but it did come from Azure as well. So even that one kind of fits that same narrative. So I'm going to dive a little bit into each one. So Power BI, and please, if I get any of this history wrong, correct me in the questions. I'll make sure to correct myself. This is based on, I've done a bit of research on this. A lot of it's just based on my recollection of being in this space for the last few years. But I believe kind of Power BI itself came from the SQL Server team. So they were working on basically kind of a project on top of SQL Server, and they came up with this Power BI concept. I know it had some weird code names way back in the day, but essentially, again, Power BI is your business intelligence, your reporting tool, and it came from the database, the SQL Server team. Then we have Power Automate. So, and within Power Automate, we've actually got two types of Power Automate flows. Now, if you're not familiar, before Power Automate, the product was named Microsoft Flow. but that was kind of before the acquisition of Softmotive. So within Power Automate, you got your two types. You got your cloud flows, and that really was what Microsoft Flow was. And Microsoft Flow, I believe, originated from SharePoint. So I believe what happened is Microsoft was working on a new workflow engine for SharePoint. That turned into Microsoft Flow, that turned into Power Automate, and that turned into Cloud Flows. So those are flows that run in the cloud, so they're not running on a particular machine. It's automation of processes in the cloud, basically your kind of classic workflows type thing. Then they also have desktop flows, which are the ones that are actually running on a machine. So think of this as like the kind of remote process automation, where if you watch the machine if you're sitting at the machine and you're watching it, literally the mouse is moving around and clicking on things. And that's super helpful in cases where you're dealing with old applications that may not have any sort of APIs, programming interfaces, any sort of ways to get in them using my kind of more traditional development techniques. So you literally have to pretend like you have to click on things to make things happen. So ways of automating that, if you got to enter in 100 leads into the same thing from a SQL database or from a spreadsheet, you can still automate that by automating the clicking and not having to have a human do all the clicking. So Power Automate now kind of has those two things. SharePoint, so Flow, I believe, was kind of more of an internally developed tool, whereas the desktop side was an acquisition a couple of years ago, and Microsoft has integrated that into the Power Automate product. Power Apps. So within Power Apps, there are two. I'm still stuck in the land of three when Power Pages was Power Apps portals. But as of now, Power Apps, there are two kinds of Power Apps. So one of those is Canvas apps, and I believe that comes from the world of SharePoint. And we also have model-driven apps, and that comes from the world of Dynamics CRM or Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement, as it's now known. So this one, I think, is one of the big ones. I do see a lot of people basically assume that because they're both Power Apps, these technologies are very much the same. So they'll be, if they're proficient in one, they either assume that they'll be proficient in the other, or they'll assume that because a feature exists in one, it must exist in the other one because they're Power Apps. As you can see, one came from SharePoint, one came from Dynamics. Two very separate worlds, and so they don't come from, they're very separate products. Now, of course, Microsoft is doing lots of work to make them work together. You can embed Canvas and model-driven, all that sort of stuff. But they still came from very different places, and I still consider them a lot more different than they are the same. So don't let the Microsoft branding wizards confuse you with the fact that they're both called Power Apps. And even more evident when back in the day, Power Pages was a type of Power App. You had Canvas apps, model-driven apps, and Power Apps portals. Again, three very different technologies. Obviously, model-driven and Power Apps portals were kind of more similar, but still, you got different technologies there, so don't let the marketing confuse you there. Power Virtual Agent, that one, I believe it's basically kind of some layers on top of some of the bot stuff that exists in Azure. To be honest with you, I don't deal a whole lot with Power Apps. Paul's saying he doesn't think Canvas apps came from SharePoint, and that could be. The reason I say that is that most of the people I know who are experts in Canvas apps came from the SharePoint world, so I don't know if it was just that was the world where people learned about them first, but it seems like all the people I know who are experts in Canvas apps were SharePoint administrators at some point. So, but I could be wrong there. And then, of course, lastly, we talk about Power Pages. That came from ADX Studios, and we will get a little bit more into a deeper dive into the history of Power Pages. But I think, again, when I have a new employee start and I kind of go through, who we are, what we do, I think it's important that they understand the Power Platform and how it's this kind of ecosystem, but that's made up of all these different parts, and those different parts came from different places. So along those same lines, I did want to talk about Dynamics as well, because Dynamics itself has somewhat of a similar history in that it came from different places. I still deal with, in fact, I had calls today where you deal with people, they say, oh, you know Dynamics, and they're asking me about Dynamics F&O. It's like, no, I don't touch F&O. That's a world I know, not a whole lot about, very little. So just to to think that just because it's Dynamics, there's lots going on in there. So going back to the original, like when I first got started in 2009 in this space, Dynamics is a product line in the same way that Office is a product line. Dynamics is a product line. So when you say I work in Dynamics, I'd be like, oh, I work in Office. You don't work in Office. You either work in Word, or you work in Excel, or you work in Access, or you work in PowerPoint. There's all these different applications, and there's a good chance that if you're an expert in one of those, if you build a whole bunch of stuff for one of those, you may not know as much about some of the other ones. Like often you're focused on one particular spot. So with Dynamics, when I first started in 2009, what there was basically two types of product lines within Dynamics. There was Dynamics CRM, CRM standing for Customer Relationship Management, and basically a customer database that dealt with sales, customer service, a little bit of marketing in there. So that was Microsoft's CRM. Now, also within the Dynamics product line were a number of ERPs. So there was one CRM, and Microsoft built that from scratch. I believe like Microsoft, CRM version 1.0 was a Microsoft product. From day one, Microsoft built that. It's a completely opposite story on the ERP side. So ERPs, enterprise resource planning, that's the software that large businesses use to run things like HR, like inventory, all sorts of like giant business stuff. In that particular line of thing, Microsoft actually had a number of different products. So the ones that I've kind of seen are, there was Dynamics AX, Dynamics Nav, Dynamics SL, Dynamics GP. And all of those were actual acquisitions by Microsoft of other companies. So Dynamics AX actually came from Axapta, Dynamics Nav was Navision, Dynamics SL was Solomon, and Dynamics GP was Great Plains. So most organizations would have a single ERP, and they may or may not have CRM. So in general, most organizations had at most two Dynamics applications, because you'd have an ERP and possibly CRM. But unless you're dealing with an acquisition or some sort of crazy thing, hopefully you are dealing with multiple ERPs in the same company. Now, all of those Dynamics products eventually got, sorry, not all of them, a few of those Dynamics products eventually got moved so that there were cloud versions of them. So that's when we start seeing the Dynamics 365. So for example, Dynamics CRM eventually was renamed Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement. And then from a licensing perspective, we've got sales and customer service and lots of different things in there. We've got marketing, we've got new things in there. But what used to be known as Dynamics CRM is now kind of essentially known as Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement. Dynamics AX is basically where Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, or Dynamics 365 F&O. And the other one that's kind of the cloud-based version is there's Dynamics 365 Business Central, and that's where that's kind of the evolution of Dynamics Nav or Navision. So let's see here. So that's kind of the history. I think it's kind of important for people to understand that, again, all of these things are relatively separate. I don't know too many people who are experts in more than one of these. F&O and customer engagements are definitely the most popular, but usually, you may have companies that have the experience in both, but usually it's different people that will be the experts in those, and maybe there'll be people kind of the experts on how to integrate them, that sort of thing. But these are kind of very different. These are all very different tools, all coming from different places. Yeah, I think it's useful for people to know kind of what all, where these things came from and what they used to be called. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about was Dataverse. So if you don't know what Dataverse is, Dataverse is it's like a database technology. Like, it is a database technology, but it's actually a layer of abstraction on top of other existing database technologies. So Dataverse is the primary database technology within Microsoft Power Platform. It's actually a combination of, underneath the hood, it's SQL, it's Cosmos DB, it's Azure Blob Storage. And in addition to just being, often a great place to store your business data, it includes additional features that you don't get with just a traditional, say, SQL database. There's a security model built in. It comes with its own APIs that are just kind of built in. It has the ability to build plugins and workflows into it. There's a whole bunch of features that Dataverse offers you on top of being just a database. Now, Dataverse itself is actually, it came from the world of Dynamics CRM. So back in the day, we had Dynamics CRM. Eventually, it kind of evolved to the point where Dataverse was kind of somewhat extracted out of Dynamics CRM and became its own thing. In terms of its name, when it first became its own thing, it was first known as the Common Data Service, or CDS. So you still may see some old references to CDS, but wherever you see CDS, Common Data Service, that is what's now known as Dataverse. So think of it as it's a database, but it's even more than a database. It's a very cool piece of technology that started in Dynamics CRM, and is actually tied to the next concept that I want to talk about, which is XRM. So I'm not sure how many of you may or may not have heard of the term XRM, but XRM comes from, it's basically a change from CRM. So again, CRM is customer relationship management. XRM is anything relationship management, where the X is basically our X from math is kind of an unknown. It can be anything. So XRM is anything relationship management. So essentially what was happening, and this was even the case when I first got into the space all those years ago, is Microsoft realized, I don't know, I'm probably putting words in their mouth, but I'm assuming this is how it went. Microsoft realized that if you're building a CRM, not every business works the same. So we have to give people the ability to customize the CRM to fit their needs. And in order to do that, we have to give them the ability to add new fields to the tables in the database. We need them to be able to customize the forms and the interface for their thing, for their CRM. We need them to be able to add new fields and move fields around and remove fields and all that sort of stuff, so that, because every business is just different enough that everyone needs kind of the ability to customize it. And they probably need the ability to create their own tables, and let's give them a little bit of flexibility in the CRM that we built. So focusing on building the CRM, they actually built this platform that could be used not just for customer relationship management, but for anything relationship management. So you could build things that had really nothing to do with customer relationship management, but it really just became an easy way to build data-driven applications very quickly and pretty cost effectively, as compared to starting from scratch, spinning up a SQL server, building an authentication model, building the security model, building out the UI model, all that sort of stuff. You could do that very quickly with Dynamics CRM, as it was known at the time. And what I've just described eventually, and for years, people are saying, hey, Microsoft, we're using this platform, but we're really not using the CRM side of it. Can we pay less? Like, we don't want to pay for everything that was like there. We don't need a full CRM. We just kind of need this base platform. So eventually what Microsoft did is they actually started extracting out those features so that you could essentially access them without being a Dynamics customer. And that is where model-driven Power Apps and Dataverse came from. So Dataverse was that database, was that CRM database that you could add tables to, add columns to, and model-driven apps is that interface that you can customize. You can add, customize the forms and views and all that sort of stuff. That's where model-driven Power Apps come from, and that's where Dataverse comes from. So XRM is still very much alive and well. And after many years of partners asking for lower pricing, because they knew they could sell a bunch of more of this platform if not everyone had to pay for the Dynamics licenses, which historically haven't been the cheapest thing in the world. So now when you've got your per app license of $5 a month, back in the day, if you're spending $100 a month for a Dynamics license, $5 a month is probably a little bit more palatable. So that's kind of where the term XRM comes from. You'll see XRM if you're a pro code person, you'll see it in some of the Microsoft namespaces, and just in general, there's a community around it. You'll see XRM in a lot of places. So I think it's kind of important that people know what the word or what the letters XRM stand for if you ever run into it. All right. Next, so let's talk about Power Pages. So I've kind of given this long history of Power Platform. We've talked about all the different parts of the Power Platform. We've talked about Dataverse. We've talked about XRM. So let's talk about Power Pages specifically. So ADX Studio. And if you've ever kind of looked at the tables that are used in Power Pages, you'll see they're all ADX _ something. ADX Studio was a web development company based right here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, that before they got into the space of building out portals with Dynamics, they actually had a content management system based in just kind of regular .NET code and SQL Server. So if you're not familiar, a content management system is essentially a way to allow non-technical users to build a website. It's like WordPress, Wix, those like Squareflow, those types of sites are content management systems. So ADX Studio had something called ADX Studio CMS. It was a .NET-based content management system kind of that they built from the ground up using .NET code and SQL Server. And at some point, they kind of saw the opportunity of using their skills that they had in the CMS space and building something like that in Dynamics CRM. So when we talk about an XRM application, building a portal or building a website or a content management system on top of what was then known as Dynamics CRM, that's a very good example of like, hey, this isn't customer relationship management. They're building a content management system. And of course, once you have that portal on top of it, I mean, we're all here because we know we're interested in Power Pages. We all know the value of being able to interact directly with your business data, having external users in there. So it was pretty clear from the get-go that could be a very good business proposition to say, hey, you've got all this data in your CRM, let's expose that to the world. And of course, back in those days, the typical CRM situation was a help desk. You got your support cases in there. Let's let users create their own help desk tickets, respond to help desk tickets, all that sort of stuff. Another classic example would be on your website. You have a contact us lead submission form. Rather than that sending an email to someone, why doesn't that create a lead directly in CRM? So when I joined ADX Studio in 2009, they were just kind of in the process of, I think they were still like a version out, but they was just starting to get going. They were still doing a lot of ADX Studio CMS work, but then they were also starting to get into the CRM side of things. So ADX Studio did a great job with that. It became a very popular product. And there were a number of kind of minor acquisitions along the road. ADX Studio is also the one that built the link provider for CRM entities. At one point, it was known as CRM Metal and is now known as the CRM Service Util. So that was actually something that ADX Studio did as well. So at first, I believe Microsoft acquired kind of a basic version of the portals. So there was the Microsoft CRM portals that had a couple kind of basic examples. And then eventually Microsoft said, you know what, we just want it all. So in 2015, Microsoft purchased ADX Studio Portals, and it was rebranded as Dynamics 365 Portals. Probably the biggest change between ADX Studio Portals and the Dynamics 365 Portals was Microsoft has only ever offered Dynamics 365 Portals as a software as a service application. Whereas ADX Studio provided you the code. It was basically, hey, here's some code. It can talk to Dynamics, and you can kind of build a website using this code as a starting template. Microsoft always hosted that code on your behalf, and so that changed the way that we could build websites. Whereas with ADX Studio, we could add our own .NET code directly to the project because we were the ones that had to put it up on a server somewhere. Whereas with Microsoft hosting that on our behalf, we had other options for how we could customize it. So the big shift, at least in my opinion, from ADX Studio to the Microsoft model was Microsoft was SaaS. ADX Studio, when they were acquired, was getting into the SaaS model, but it was only kind of one of their offerings. It wasn't the only offering. So Microsoft acquired ADX Studio, turned it into, renamed it Dynamics 365 Portals, and ever since it's been kind of this SaaS product. Now, at one point, Microsoft did take the source code. So the last version of ADX Studio Portals was version 7. So when Microsoft took it over, their first release was known as version 8. Microsoft did take a version, it was version 8.2. They took the source code, they literally took a dump of their source code and put it and released it for download so that you could actually take their source code and run a site yourself that was basically a pretty much identical copy of version 8.2 of their code. Now they did that for a couple of reasons. It did assist with CRM on-premise customers because the Microsoft SaaS offering was only available for CRM Online. So it did help customers who were on-premise and basically their only option was to use this version 8.2. What it also did is it allowed customers who were on ADX Studio version 7, it gave them an upgrade path to go to the cloud. So if that customer was using CRM Online, they could use that version 8.2 as kind of a stepping stone to get into the cloud. So version 8.2 does still exist. It's out there. Addoxio, a company that was spun out of ADX Studio after the acquisition, did maintain that code a little bit and it was known as the XRM Portals Community Edition. You can still find that on GitHub, so you can see the source code for much of what still is in Power Pages today is up there. So if you're ever kind of interested in diving through the code and seeing what the code looks like, you can always look up the XRM Portals Community Edition. And that, honestly, it's something I still look at on at least a couple times a week. I'm in that code just to see when people ask me questions about how does this thing work. Generally, what I'm doing is I'm going into that code to see how it works. Now, of course, that code's old, but a lot of the things like having to do with lists and forms hasn't been changed a lot since then. So a lot of that code is still very relevant. So at that point, it's still known as Dynamics 365 Portals. Then a couple of years later, Microsoft announced a rebranding of the product, and it was known as Power Apps Portals. The big change there was, and this goes back to, we were talking about Dataverse. Back in the day when you had CRM Online, CRM Online was Dynamics. Eventually, they came to the point where you could get Dataverse, so they extracted Dataverse out of Dynamics CRM. So you had this Dataverse. They got to the point where you could actually install Power Apps on Dataverse that didn't necessarily have the Dynamics kind of add-ons added to it. So when they extracted and started offering Dataverse as a product, if you just had Dataverse and you didn't necessarily have Dynamics, which of course costed more money, if you needed Dynamics licenses versus just the licenses that you needed for Power Apps, you could now install a portal directly on plain Dataverse without needing all the Dynamics apps. So that meant that the licensing for internal users using and managing the portals was drastically reduced if you weren't using things like the help desk or some of the other templates. So Microsoft made it possible for users who were just using kind of plain Dataverse, or CDS as it was kind of still known back then. If you had just plain CDS, you could now install a portal. And so they basically made Power Apps Portals one of the 3 types of Power Apps alongside Canvas apps and model-driven apps. And essentially every time they make one of these announcements, you can see the product kind of moving higher and higher up the stack in terms of importance of where it sits in the Microsoft Business Applications space. Of course, now you'll know that in 2022, in the fall, Microsoft released or announced another name change, and that's to Power Pages. And that just means it's no longer even a type of Power App. It's now one of those main features within the Power Platform. And this one is more of a marketing thing. It's not so much a technology thing. It's still based in Dataverse. It's still very much related to model-driven apps because the forms and views that you're building in your model-driven apps still apply to Power Pages. But it just shows you that the investment that Microsoft is making in this particular platform. And yeah, Power Pages, it's at the top now. It really can't get any bigger unless I guess it goes outside the Power Platform. But I think I'm not expecting that anytime soon. So yeah, that's kind of the history. Again, code that existed in ADX Studio portals, many years ago still exists in Power Pages. So all this stuff that you'll see from a long time ago, a lot of it's still relevant. So I hope people, I still get this question all the time. Oh, should I use Power Apps portals or should I use Power Pages? You don't have a choice. That it is one product. They're just new names. Yes, there are kind of new versions. So one thing that might confuse that matter these days is the portals Power Pages Studio. So the new version of the Studio, they call the Power Pages Studio. The old version of the Studio, they call the Power Apps Studio. But in the end, you still have one site and it's a Power Pages site. You can use the old Editor Studio if you want, but you can use either one. So Power Pages is the new name. If you started 5 years ago with Power Apps Dynamics 365 portals, rest assured you have Power Pages. It's all one and the same. All right. This is the last slide I have here before we get into the date for the next call and Q&A time. So the last one here is I just want to talk about within the Power Platform, the difference between connectors versus Dataverse. So all of these different products that we're talking about within the Power Platform generally rely on one or the other. And so connectors are these connections that exist to literally like hundreds of other data sources. So if you're familiar with either Power Automate uses them, Canvas Apps uses them, Power BI can use them. There's all these things that connect to like Microsoft competitors. So you got some for Salesforce, Oracle, SAP, Gmail, like all these different connectors that connect to almost anything you could ever hope for in the world. Other things within the Power Platform are specifically designed to work on Dataverse. They don't really touch the connector framework unless you're then connecting through something else. So the biggest examples of those are model-driven apps and Power Pages. So Power Pages is built directly on top of Dataverse. You require Dataverse. You must have Dataverse in order to have Power Pages. Excuse me. Model-driven apps are the same thing. They're literally built directly on top of Dataverse. You must have Dataverse and use model-driven apps. So I'm often presented with options where people come to me and say, hey, I want to use Power Pages, but I don't really like, my stuff isn't in Dataverse. So how do we connect Power Pages to something else? And I often tell them that you're probably barking up the wrong tree. If your data isn't meant to be in Dataverse, what you're then setting yourself up for is an integration project, because yes, on Power Pages, you could connect, use APIs and talk to other things. You could use virtual tables. You can do those things, but I really think that the real value of Power Pages is when your data is in Dataverse. And the same thing with model-driven apps. Model-driven apps are meant to be in Dataverse. Yes, you can use virtual tables. Yes, you can do integrations. But to me, those should be and you can do that. But if you're not using Dataverse anyways, I think you're probably setting yourself up for not an ideal scenario. Whereas things like Canvas Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, those use the connectors. Now, of course, there's a connector for Dataverse. So Canvas Apps can use Dataverse. Power Automate can use Dataverse. Power BI can use Dataverse. In fact, Dataverse might be the best connector there is for those. But the difference is that you can use all those different things, whereas with Power Pages and model-driven apps, there is an inherent dependency on Dataverse, whereas with those other ones, again, Power Virtual Agents is the one I'm not so sure about. I think they can use kind of both via Power Automate or whatever, but certainly with Power Pages and model-driven apps, you must have Dataverse, and the rest, Dataverse is one of the options. So The other part I really want to highlight is, again, if we go back to my comments earlier about Power Apps and how people, they'll know Canvas or they'll know Model Driven App and they think, oh, it's just Power Apps, it's all the same. You can see here, if you build Canvas apps that connect to SharePoint or Office 365 and you've never touched Dataverse and you want to go build model driven apps, like that's just a whole new thing to learn, and vice versa. If you've built model driven apps where you've created tables in Dataverse your whole life and then you go over to Canvas app that are going to use SharePoint lists, like it's just such a different thing. So yes, they have they're under the same umbrella, but two very separate products. All right, so let's quickly talk about the next call we've got scheduled for March 16th, 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, because that will be right after the time changes. So still 3 p.m. for the East Coast folks. It'll be a different time for me because we're special here in Saskatchewan and don't do daylight savings. So instead of it being at 2 o'clock for me, it'll be at 1 o'clock. I want to thank Jason again from MS Dynamics World for their support, and let me check to see if we have any questions. So even the new project for the web uses Dataverse. Yeah. So Dataverse is becoming a very core component of many Microsoft offerings. New project for web. That was kind of replacing the PSA stuff. I think that was in Dynamics for a bit, which is not really there. So Dataverse, very, very, very critical to the Power Platform. Even those ones where even Power Automate that doesn't necessarily depend on Dataverse, if you want to do proper ALM, the way that works is solutions in Dataverse. So Dataverse is still critical for those things, but it's just important to understand that in some of those, like Dataverse, literally, if you don't have one of those, it doesn't work. All right, any other questions? I'm not seeing any yet. I don't know.
Hey Nick, can I throw in a couple of recollections from the history of Power Platform?
Absolutely.
So when it comes to Canvas apps, my best recollection of the connection to SharePoint is not that they came from SharePoint directly, but that kind of the first and best connector originally was into SharePoint lists using them as a data source. And I believe that was the real kind of early killer app that got SharePoint people excited about it, and anyone who wanted an easy data source. But I think Canvas apps, I believe they came from a collection of different sort of skunkworks projects. One that came to mind as you started talking was one from 2015 called GigJam, which I covered at that time. I just found the article for it, and it was this sort of prototype, rapid application development, drag and drop with access control and data protections and collaborative stuff in it. So I think that was part of it, and then I think there was some acquired IP too, as I recall, but I don't know what it was now. And then Power Automate, I believe it has its roots in the same place that Azure Logic Apps does, and they engineered it to be a different product, but that a lot of the underlying
Azure Logic Apps are definitely basically just a different licensing model. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but yeah, it's really very, very simple. And yeah, regarding the SharePoint and Canvas apps, I just know that when I think of who I would go to if I had a Canvas apps, like Shane Young and a couple of other folks, when I first started going to conferences and seeing people talk about Canvas apps, they're all SharePoint MVPs. So I guess I just assumed that it was just a feature, kind of like how when, if you look at all the people who know Dataverse, so they all came from the CRM world. So I thought maybe it was the same thing, but interesting that it was maybe just its own thing.
Yeah, if anyone knows more about that, please let us know.
Okay, so a couple questions here. So when do you think HTML tag namings like article and main will be integrated? I mean, I think the most likely opportunity for that would be part of the Bootstrap 5 redesign. I don't know if they're intending on redoing those templates, but I don't know. I don't know if that's super high on their priority list. I know accessibility is high on their priority list, and I mean that's somewhat tied to accessibility, but I haven't heard anything specifically about those tags. But logically, I would think that the Bootstrap 5 upgrade would be a place to do that. another question here. So for proper ALM, should we be paying for a Power Pages converted to production in every environment, or is there some cheaper option? Yeah, so you can set up if you're talking about like versus trial, yeah, you should have a production Power Page in every environment. You can set it as whether it's kind of pre-production or not, but you don't pay per instance anymore. So it's not really a cost option in terms of like back in the day, the licensing was you pay $500 a month per instance. So here you're paying more for logins. And so in those pre-production instances, your logins should be pretty small, and it's usually the same people kind of over and over again. So one of the cheapest way to get to do that is you just license all the people with like a per app license for Power Apps. And if you got like 5 developers or something, you're paying $5 a month or whatever for their licenses, or get them an unlimited apps licenses, and they can do development and test and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, the cost concern shouldn't be there as much because they've now moved to monthly active users instead of daily active users. And yeah, you're only paying for the login, so you don't have to pay like you shouldn't be paying $500. You might be paying $50 a month for your environment, but it shouldn't be a cost killer for pre-production unless for some reason you have hundreds of people testing. Okay, I think that's all I got for questions. I see it. We're 1 minute over, so thank you, Jason, and I think we can probably end it here.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Nick. As always, great to have you hosting. We'll end the session here. Thanks, everyone, and please be on the lookout for information on the recording and the link to next month's event. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.